This is a house in Saskatchewan. You'd be forgiven for thinking it looks a little strange. It's quite stout, and its walls angle outwards at the bottom. It almost looks as though it had once been a normal house that melted into what we see here. However, this house is not the result of poor construction. In fact, it is actually the opposite. Behind the white vinyl exterior siding of this house are blocks of sod, and behind that sod lies centuries of history and architecture. Long before the arrival of Europeans in America, the indigenous American tribes of the Great Plains constructed many different types of dwellings varying in size and shape depending on their uses and the regions in which they were built. Because trees and driftwood could be relatively scarce on the plains, groups that inhabited these areas had no choice but to use wood sparingly in their constructions, given the difficulties associated with obtaining and transporting timber. Unlike the longhouses and wigwams used by Iroquois and Ojibwe peoples in the forested Northeast, dwellings built by groups that inhabited the plains often use wood as a secondary material, with the primary material being something else, such as animal skins, sod, or dry grass. One of the more well-known types of buildings is the tepee, a structure which provided much-needed shelter, but could also be put up and taken down quickly as part of the nomadic lifestyles of some of the plains tribes. For more permanent dwellings, however, especially in the central and northern Great Plains, sod was the ideal building material. A number of tribes, including the Omaha and the Kansaw, would construct semi-subterranean lodges to serve their non-nomadic lifestyles. Earthen homes weren't unique to the Great Plains. They were also used by groups such as the Puebloan peoples in what would become the United States Southwest, but the earthen homes in the central and northern Great Plains were particularly helpful in surviving the bitter cold of particularly harsh environments where few other resources were available. The design of these buildings, whether simple or complex, has a few common characteristics. First, a floor was dug into the ground. Then, supports were added, upon which turf could be placed. The turf would soon grow into grass and blend into the surrounding landscape. Lodges often had a round shape complete with a hole in the top, so that a fire could be made in the center of the room and smoke could waft up through the hole. In order to keep the building especially warm, the entrance was usually separated from the main room by a tunnel or hallway, which itself was covered to prevent drafts and possible rainfall. Being partly underground, these lodges kept cool in the summer and warm in the winter, especially when aided by a fire. Although the role played by Scandinavians in the colonization of the Americas is negligible from a modern-day standpoint, the explorers who came to the North American continent from Greenland and Iceland are widely accepted to be the first Europeans to see the Americas. Lansaw Meadows, meaning the bay with the grasslands, in modern-day Nova Scotia, is the most notable settlement west of Greenland and was built on a large grassy meadow on the seaside. Much like the earth lodges built by indigenous Americans who inhabited similar biomes, the buildings constructed by Scandinavians at Lansaw Meadows were built with sod wrapped around or over a wooden frame. They erected walls from an inner and outer layer of sod blocks, the inside of which was filled with gravel or other loose material. Wooden frames were erected over these walls, and then upon them sod was placed to form curved, grassy roofs. There were striking similarities between the Scandinavians' shelters and lodges built by indigenous peoples, reflected in the types of material used, the construction methods, and the small details such as smoke holes that were added for convenience. Both types of structures were born out of those few materials available to their builders, as well as a need for warmth and shelter from the elements. It wasn't until much later, starting in the early to mid-1800s, that European settlers and immigrants from the eastern shores of America moved into what is now the Great Plains region, where much like the other groups, they would find themselves in a land with few trees and plentiful sod. Throughout the 19th century, the fledgling Canadian and United States governments enacted policies that motivated settlers to manifest their destiny by moving westward and occupying the land, using coercion or brute force to drive the indigenous people from it. One such policy enacted in Canada in 1872 was the Dominion Lands Act, which allowed for settlers, corporations, and religious groups to receive land grants in the west of Canada. Largely as a result of this act, hundreds of thousands of settlers came to the region to claim one of the 625,000 land patents that were granted over the life of this specific policy. The policies of homestead legislation created by the United States had led to similar migration patterns in the decade prior. While cheap or free land seemed like an excellent deal to many such settlers, the specific plots of land granted to them could be considered suboptimal for homesteading and semi-permanent living. Many homesteaders found themselves without the resources to construct a home or the funds to pay someone else to build one for them. As a result, many settlers lived in what is called a soddy, a house made from blocks of sod cut from the prairie. Although the matted roots of prairie grasses provided structural support to these makeshift homes, soddies generally degraded quickly and only served as temporary housing while the homesteaders worked up the means to build houses made of more traditional materials. Soddies were often quite small and suffered from muddy interiors when it rained on the grass roofs, and even installations such as windows and doors were seen as something of a low-level luxury. Needless to say, very few soddies are still around today. While not many soddies have survived to the present day, this house, the Addison Sod House in Saskatchewan, is a clear exception. This longevity can be attributed not only to its use of modern vinyl siding, but also to the unique construction of the sod walls themselves. One final small detail of earthen lodges and halls is that the walls are often built to be thicker towards the bottom than the top. Because of this, there is a greater amount of material supporting the weight of the walls, and they would better handle stress over time. In the case of the Addison Sod House, this principle was taken to its logical extreme, and the walls of the house are twice as thick at the bottom than at the top. Additionally, the creator of the house was selective in the sod used, opting for sod with unusually thick plant roots that held it together. These changes, combined with a somewhat meticulous upkeep over the years, meant that the Addison Sod House is still standing and being lived in today. Most people who are familiar with the history of sod houses would agree that they are essentially a relic of the past. However, between the earthen walls and the grassy roofs, sod houses represent something greater than just antiquated buildings. Sod houses represent a closeness with the natural world. In the past, this closeness and connection to nature was born out of necessity. Sod was available, sod was abundant, and sod provided for us. In the future, we may find ourselves following the same path, one in which necessity is the driving force behind how we build and live in our homes. As deforestation, loss of natural habitat, and global climate change threaten our chances for a livable future, the integration of sustainable building materials and practices is a must. To understand the extent of the problem, one need only look so far as the sidewalks that line our streets. Concrete is the second most widely used substance on Earth, following water. If the concrete and cement industry were its own nation, it would be the third largest producer of carbon dioxide in the world, behind China and the United States. That accounts for anywhere from 4 to 8% of the world's CO2 output. Additionally, our use of concrete is responsible for nearly 10% of the world's industrial water usage, 75% of which occurs in regions that already experience droughts and water insecurity. Conventional uses for cement are unsustainable, and unless new innovations are able to change that, we may find ourselves relying on other existing construction materials. Cob houses are one such example. Keeping with techniques used for over 10,000 years, the proper mixture of clay, sand, and straw creates a reliable, fire-resistant material that regulates temperature well. If problems do arise with cob houses, instead of tearing down walls, the material can instead be reapplied over existing walls, which saves on construction costs. Cob is not only a desirable material for housing, but also can be used when constructing barns, animal pens, and storage sheds, as well as smaller structures such as pizza ovens. One of the downsides of cob houses is that they can begin to break down in excessive moisture, but this can be mitigated through the use of dehumidifiers and proper ventilation in wetter climates. Another potential alternative for concrete is rammed earth, which also has been used extensively throughout the world for many centuries. Rammed earth itself is simply subsoil, or a mixture of sand, gravel, and clay that is moistened and compressed until it is tightly compacted. Once demolished, rammed earth can be recycled or reused, which allows for new structures to be built from old ones. In addition, rammed earth can be constructed from materials extracted directly from the construction site, meaning that materials don't need to be transported over long distances. Like cob houses, rammed earth can also break down under excessive moisture, but unlike cob, rammed earth isn't a very thermally resistant material. Many of the issues that rammed earth faces can be solved with the addition of a small amount of cement or other stabilizers to the mixture. While some see this newly stabilized rammed earth as a clever workaround to our overdependence on cement, others see it as counteractive to the ultimate goal of maximizing sustainability and environmentalism. One more approach to environmentally sound architecture is the green roof movement, which aims to reduce our carbon footprint and increase our quality of life by utilizing the space on the rooftops of buildings for gardens, forests, farms, and gathering spaces. These roofs provide habitat for pollinators, insulate buildings, absorb stormwater, and improve air quality. When done right, the results are something to be proud of, and in a very peculiar way, they harken back to the green, grassy roofs of those little sod houses on the prairies so long ago. When I was looking for resources to do this project, I was reminded by my mother that my grandmother on my father's side had lived in a sod house for some time when she was younger. It would have been in eastern Montana, and she had moved there from Norway and moved in with some relatives, and they put her up in the sod house. There are some photographs that my family has, and I looked through them, and unfortunately I wasn't able to find any photos that clearly showed a sod house. It is possible that some of the houses shown in the photos were once sod houses that have since been covered up with boards and converted into more traditional houses. But regardless, I was pretty disappointed that I wasn't able to find any photos of clear sod houses to use in this project. But very quickly, that sense of disappointment from not having found the photos I wanted was overwhelmed by this immense feeling of awe at just the countless interesting and amazing things that were actually depicted in the photographs. There were photographs of men riding horseback and old cars and a couple dancing to the accordion and soldiers and dogs. But one thing that stood out to me in particular among a lot of the photos was just how incredibly expansive the prairie was and how flat it was and just devoid of really anything that the eye could pick up, or the camera, I guess, for that matter. And I think it really occurred to me exactly how flat and giant these prairies were when I was organizing the photos, and I was looking for photos that showed the prairie, and I accidentally slipped this photo in, which upon closer inspection later I realized actually showed the ocean. But the fact that, to my unconscious mind, when I wasn't really thinking about it, the fact that this was the same as the prairie, I think just goes to show how similar those two things can be, the ocean and the prairie. And I actually have a quote that resonated with me pretty deeply about that by Ole Edvard Rulvåg, who wrote Giants in the Earth. And perhaps this quote stuck out to me in particular just because it was about Norwegian American experiences in the Midwest, but it goes, "Here was the endless prairie, so rich in its blessings of fertility, but also full of great loneliness, a form of freedom which curiously affected the minds of strangers, especially those to whom the Lord had given a sad heart.